She was just a little girl, innocent, fragile, and hungry for kindness. But instead of love, she got cruelty. One ordinary morning, her stepmother stood over her, cold eyes filled with disdain, before tipping a glass of milk onto the child's trembling hands. The room went silent, except for the little girl's quiet sobs. But then, something unexpected happened. A stranger, wealthy, powerful, and watching from the corner, rose to his feet. His voice thundered across the room with one word that would change everything: stop. What followed was a moment no one could have predicted. Under the pale light of a new morning, the kitchen carried the faint smell of boiled milk and fresh bread. A little girl sat at the wooden table, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the empty plate before her. She wasn't expecting kindness. She had learned long ago not to. When her stepmother entered the room, her footsteps sharp against the floorboards, the girl tensed as though bracing for a storm. The woman's gaze was cold, heavy, and unforgiving, carrying with it the weight of disdain she never bothered to hide. In her hand, she carried a glass of milk, not as nourishment but as a weapon of humiliation. Without a word, she tilted it forward, letting the cold liquid spill across the little girl's fragile fingers and lap. The child gasped, her lips quivering, not so much from the cold as from the cruelty. Her eyes welled up, but she dared not speak. She had learned silence was safer. From the far end of the room, a man watched. His suit was tailored, his shoes polished, and his very presence commanded attention. He had come as a guest, an observer of a household that tried to keep its ugly truths tucked neatly away. Yet what he had just witnessed shook something deep within him, something raw and long buried. He had seen wealth and power, deceit and greed, but there was something about the trembling child before him that tore down every wall he had built around his heart. When the glass emptied and silence pressed down like a suffocating fog, his chair scraped back suddenly against the floor. The sharp sound startled the room. His voice thundered with a single word, one so powerful it seemed to echo in every corner. Stop. The stepmother froze, startled by the command. She turned, her face a mixture of shock and indignation. Never before had anyone dared to challenge her in her own house. Never before had a guest disrupted the quiet cruelty she practiced daily. The little girl looked up, her wet lashes blinking in disbelief. No one had ever spoken for her, no one had ever cared enough to intervene. That one word felt like a hand reaching out, like a shield placed between her and the storm. The man's chest heaved, his fists clenched at his sides. He was no stranger to power struggles, but this was different. He saw himself in her, the helplessness, the pain of being small in a world that seemed designed to break those who had no one. Memories surged back uninvited. He remembered a cold night in his own childhood, the sting of hunger, the laughter of those who thought him less. He remembered hands pushing him down, voices telling him he would never matter. He had risen from that, built an empire, carved his name into the very stones of the city, but the scars remained, hidden beneath silken success. And here, before his eyes, was a child carrying the same scars. He could not look away. His voice cut through the silence again, deeper this time, trembling with restrained fury. How dare you treat her like this? The question hung in the air, more accusation than inquiry. The stepmother straightened, her lips curling into a practiced sneer. She laughed bitterly, a hollow sound, and brushed off the moment as if it were trivial. Just discipline, she said. Just a lesson for a stubborn child. But the man's eyes burned with a fire that made even her falter. Discipline was not cruelty, and lessons were not born from humiliation. He took a step closer, each movement deliberate, as though he carried the weight of the girl's dignity in his stride. The little girl's small hands trembled as she tried to wipe the milk from her lap. She expected anger, expected punishment for drawing attention, but when she dared a glance at the man's face, what she saw was not anger at her but protection, something fierce and unyielding. She had never seen anyone look at her that way, as though she mattered, as though her pain was worth fighting against. The warmth of it seeped into the cold corners of her heart, a flicker of hope she had thought long extinguished. The stepmother's voice rose, shrill and defensive, trying to reassert control. She spoke of authority, of a child who needed to be put in her place. But the man did not flinch. His presence filled the room like a storm gathering strength, and for the first time, her words seemed powerless. He turned his gaze to the girl again, softening in an instant, as though he had two faces, one carved in steel for those who harmed, and another gentle as light for the one who suffered. He bent slightly, lowering himself to her height, his eyes locking with hers. "You don't deserve this," he said quietly, words meant only for her. She swallowed hard, unable to speak, her throat tight with emotions too big for her small body. Every second stretched, and the air between them thickened with unspoken truths. The man straightened again, turning his full weight back on the stepmother. "This ends now." His tone was final, carrying the authority of someone who was never ignored. She opened her mouth to retort, but something in his eyes silenced her. It wasn't just anger. It was power, the kind born not of wealth alone but of conviction. She felt it like a force pressing against her, stripping away the control she had wielded with such ease. For the first time, she realized she could not win this battle. The little girl watched, her heart pounding. She had spent her short life believing that cruelty was normal, that her tears meant nothing, that kindness was a luxury meant for others. But in that moment, everything shifted. The man's shout, his defense, his unwavering stance, it cracked the walls of her world and let light pour through. She did not understand why he cared, or what it meant for her future, but she knew something had changed forever. The man stepped closer to the table and pulled out a chair for her, his gesture both simple and profound. "Sit," he said softly. "Eat. You are not invisible." The girl hesitated, uncertain, but his gaze was steady, patient, inviting. She climbed onto the chair slowly, still trembling, but for the first time in memory, she did not feel small. She felt seen. The stepmother stood rigid, her pride wounded, her authority crumbling. But she could not find words strong enough to reclaim her power. The man's presence was too commanding, his defense of the girl too absolute. She turned away, muttering under her breath, but her retreat was obvious. In her silence, the girl felt a strange victory, not loud or triumphant, but quiet and powerful. The man remained by her side, his eyes never leaving her as she timidly reached for the bread on her plate. He knew this was not the end. The cruelty she endured would not vanish overnight. But he had drawn a line, one that could never be erased. He had spoken the word that changed everything, stop. And in that word lived a promise. That she was no longer alone, that her pain had been seen, that her silence had finally been broken. And as the girl took her first small bite, her eyes lifted once more to the man's face. She saw in him not just a stranger, not just a guest, but something she had never dared hope for. A protector, a voice where hers had been lost, and perhaps, the beginning of a story where she was no longer the victim, but someone worth saving. The man's voice, sharp and commanding, had silenced the room, but what stirred within him was louder still. When he shouted, "Stop," it wasn't only for the child. It was for the boy he once had been, the boy who had endured nights of hunger, mornings of mockery, and the cruel indifference of those who should have cared. He saw his own story in the trembling girl before him, and though the years had given him wealth, status, and a name that echoed through the city, they had never erased the scars of his beginnings. Each scar was hidden under layers of silk, gold, and power, but now, in that moment, they ached as if they had just been made. He remembered being small, far smaller than the suits he now wore. He remembered standing barefoot on the dirt floor of a house too broken to be called a home. His father had left early, swallowed by debts, and his mother, though she tried, had little to give beyond her weary hands and tired eyes. The neighbors laughed, the other children pointed, and he wore his poverty like a brand he could not wash away. When he begged for food, he was met with pitying stares or harsh words. When he dreamed of school, his dreams were crushed by the weight of survival. Yet he endured, not because anyone protected him, but because he learned to hide his tears and turn them into fire. Now, seeing the girl with milk dripping from her clothes, her little hands shaking as if the world itself were too heavy for her to hold, that fire returned, hotter than ever. It wasn't anger alone. It was grief, it was defiance, it was the unbearable memory of helplessness. He knew what it meant to be powerless, to have no one step forward, no one defend you, no one say the simple words that could have changed everything. He had prayed for someone to notice him, to stop the cruelty, to lift him out of his silence. No one had come, but here, today, he could be the voice that he had once needed. The stepmother scoffed, her laugh brittle and shallow, as though to downplay what she had done. She claimed it was nothing, a minor act, discipline. But he could not be deceived. He knew the cruelty that hides behind the word discipline. He had lived it, every slap disguised as teaching, every insult disguised as care. He saw through her mask, and the more she spoke, the more his jaw tightened. She was not only cruel, she was shameless. And that made his blood boil. He stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking against the floor, every sound deliberate and strong. He wanted her to feel it, the weight of his presence, the authority of a man who had clawed his way to the top of the world. She tried to stand taller, but her eyes flickered with unease. It was not wealth alone that made him formidable, it was the certainty of a man who had walked through fire and survived. He did not waver, did not look away, and in his silence, she began to shrink. His eyes fell again on the girl. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tightly as though she was holding back the cry she dared not release. She wiped her lap timidly, as if trying not to make trouble. He recognized that look. He had worn it himself as a child, the desperate attempt to become invisible, to shrink so small that cruelty might pass over him. It tore him apart inside, and his chest tightened with the weight of it. She was living his old life, repeating his old pain, and he could not let her believe that silence was safety. Bending slightly, he leveled his gaze with hers. His voice softened, gentler now, but the strength within it remained. "You are not wrong," he said, words carefully chosen. "You are not unworthy, and you do not deserve this." The girl blinked rapidly, unsure if she had heard him right. No one had ever said such words to her. She searched his eyes, afraid it was a trick, but found only honesty. Her heart, which had been braced for more humiliation, stumbled at the warmth of his tone. The stepmother hissed, "Don't fill her head with nonsense. She's nothing but trouble." Her words sliced the air, but the man did not turn to her. He kept his eyes on the girl, and his voice grew steadier, each word resonating as though he were speaking to the child he once had been. "Don't believe her lies. I know what it feels like to be told you're nothing. I know what it feels like to be pushed aside, to be punished for simply existing. But I promise you, those words are not truth. You are more than they let you believe." The girl's lips parted, but no words came. Inside, her heart raced, confusion swirling with something she had never allowed herself to feel, hope. The man's tone carried a conviction too strong to dismiss. It was not pity, it was recognition, like someone finally understood the language of her pain. Memories flashed in his mind. Him, a boy, crouched behind a broken wall as older children jeered, throwing stones not to wound his body but his spirit. Him, walking past bakery windows, inhaling the scent of bread he could never afford. Him, watching men in fine clothes stride past, their heads high, their shoes clean, while he stood in the mud, unseen. Every insult, every dismissal, every time he was told he didn't matter, it lived inside him still. That pain had been his fuel, the fire that pushed him to rise, to build a fortune, to carve out a life where no one could ever again look down on him. And yet, for all he had gained, the ache of that lonely boy remained. Now, before him, was another child drowning in the same sea. And he refused to let her sink. He turned finally to the stepmother, his eyes sharp as blades. "Do you know what you've done?" he asked, his voice low but dangerous. She folded her arms, scoffing again, but the tremor in her stance betrayed her. He continued, each word deliberate. "When you humiliate a child, when you crush her spirit, you are not teaching her strength, you are teaching her despair. And despair destroys more than you can imagine." The stepmother muttered, "She's just a child. She'll forget." "No," he said firmly, his voice rising again. "She will not forget. Children never forget the moments that teach them they are worthless. Those moments stay, buried in the heart, shaping every thought, every dream, every fear. I know because I lived it. I was her once, and I will not let you break her as others tried to break me." The room fell silent again. The girl's eyes widened, shock rippling through her. He had been like her. This man, who looked untouchable, who carried himself like the world belonged to him, he had been hungry, broken, despised. She struggled to picture it, but his words rang with such raw honesty that she could not doubt them. For the first time, she felt less alone, as though someone truly understood what it meant to carry invisible wounds. He straightened, his shoulders squared, and his voice thundered with finality. This cruelty ends here, today. The stepmother, unable to hold his gaze, turned away in silence. Her lips pressed thin, but she did not challenge him again. The power she once wielded so freely had been shattered, not by violence, but by truth. The girl sat still, her breath shallow, trying to absorb what had just unfolded. Slowly, almost fearfully, she looked back at the man. His eyes, though stern a moment ago, softened once more as they met hers. There was a weight in them, but also a promise. She didn't know what it meant for tomorrow, or the day after, but in that moment, she felt the warmth of something she had never known before, protection. And deep inside the man, as he held her gaze, he felt something stir as well. A sense of purpose beyond riches, beyond titles, beyond power. He had fought his way to the top to prove the world wrong, to show that he was not worthless. But now, standing before this child, he realized his greatest victory was not in what he had gained, but in what he could give. For the first time in years, he felt his scars not as burdens, but as bridges that could connect his past pain to another's salvation.